He said I was in his debt. Those were his first words after 8 long years of silence. Alina, you're my daughter. You should do this for me. I remember staring at my phone, frozen, reading those words over and over until the letters blurred. The same man who once called me a burden every single week of my childhood was now the one begging me for help. The irony almost made me laugh. Almost. Because this wasn't just a message from some stranger. This was from the man who had shaped every scar I carried. The man who said I was nothing without him. Who told me I'd always need him to survive. And now, he needed me. He had no idea that the daughter he'd broken had built something far greater than he could ever imagine. He didn't know that the girl he called useless had turned her pain into power. That I'd built my life, piece by piece. From every insult, every slap, every moment of being made to feel small. So when that message came, I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel pity. I felt something colder. Control. Because sometimes, the most satisfying revenge isn't loud, and it isn't cruel. It's silent. It's living well enough that the people who doubted you have to face what you've become. Stay with me. Because what happened next? How a burden became a self-made millionaire. And how she reclaimed everything that was once used to destroy her. Isn't just a revenge story. It's a story about transformation, about power, about finally becoming enough for yourself. My name is Alina, and I'm 26 years old. And this is how the burden became the backbone. When people talk about childhood, they usually describe laughter, toys, and the warmth of being loved. Mine was filled with something else. Noise. Not the good kind. It was the sound of doors slamming, glass breaking, and my father's voice, always louder than everything else. That voice could fill the whole house, bounce off every wall, and settle deep in your chest like dust you couldn't breathe out. He had a phrase he loved to repeat. You're a burden, Alina. It rolled off his tongue so easily, it became part of the air we breathed. I'd hear it when I asked for something small, a pair of shoes, a school trip, a book for class. You're a burden. When I got sick, you're a burden. Even when I brought home good grades, straight A's, he'd shake his head and smirk. Grades don't pay bills. Those words stuck like pins under my skin. I tried to convince myself he didn't mean it, that maybe he was tired, or drunk, or angry at the world and I was just there. But when someone says the same thing over and over, week after week, year after year, it stops being noise. It becomes truth. He ran a construction business, always chasing big projects, bigger contracts, bigger debts. On good days, he'd come home covered in dust and pride. On bad days, he'd come home with whiskey on his breath and thunder in his eyes. You could feel the storm before it started, the heavy silence, the slow creak of the front door, the way my mom's hands would tremble while setting the table. My mom, she was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from fear, not peace. She tried to defend me sometimes, but one sharp look from him could freeze her mid-sentence. I used to wonder what it felt like to have a father who smiled when you entered the room. Someone who saw you not as a weight, but as a reason. I never knew. There was one night I'll never forget. I was 9. He came home late, drunk again. Mom had made lentils and rice, his favorite. He sat down, looked at the food, and then at me. Is this all? He barked. Mom said softly, it's what we could manage this week. He slammed his fist on the table so hard the plates jumped. Then he looked straight at me and said, if you didn't exist, Maybe I'd have enough money for real food. I didn't cry. Not then. I just stared at my plate and wished I could disappear. Later that night, I heard my mom crying in the kitchen. That sound, muffled sobs between shallow breaths, is something you never unhear. As I grew older, I thought maybe if I worked harder, he'd finally see me. So I studied. I studied like my life depended on it. Every morning before school, every night until my eyes burned. My teachers said I was brilliant. I didn't want brilliance. I wanted approval. Just one proud look. When I was 13, I came home with an award, top of my class. I held it out to him like a peace offering. He barely glanced at it. "Grades don't pay bills," he muttered, turning back to his drink. That was the first time I realized his love had a price I could never afford. The house always smelled of alcohol and concrete dust. 2 scents I still associate with dread. Some nights, he'd start shouting about his business, about clients who didn't pay, partners who betrayed him. He'd throw things. Sometimes at the wall, sometimes not. And Mom and I would shrink smaller each time, learning how to disappear in plain sight. By 15, I had stopped expecting kindness. I just wanted peace. But peace was rare in that house. That year, everything changed. He'd lost another contract. The debts were piling up. The shouting got worse. And one night, he turned that rage directly on me. I was sitting in the living room, working on an essay for school. He came in, the smell of whiskey filling the air before he even spoke. He looked at me, really looked at me, with disgust, like I was something rotting in his world. "You think you're smart, huh?" he said. I didn't answer. He stepped closer. "You'll never amount to anything. You'll just end up needing me to survive." That sentence carved itself somewhere deep inside me. He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. He said it with the calm certainty of someone making a prophecy. And the thing about hearing words like that, especially when you're 15, is that part of you starts to believe them, until another part decides to prove them wrong. I went to my room that night and sat on the floor for hours. No music. No tears. Just silence and that one sentence echoing in my head. "You'll never amount to anything." I stared at my reflection in the mirror, the bruised eyes, the trembling hands, and I made a promise to myself. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But I would leave that house. And when I did, I'd never need him for anything again. After that night, something in me hardened. I stopped trying to win his approval. Instead, I started saving. Every coin from tutoring neighborhood kids, every tip from helping my mom's friends with errands. It wasn't much, but it was mine. People at school thought I was quiet, maybe shy. They didn't know I was surviving. They didn't see the way I'd freeze when I heard footsteps behind a door. They didn't hear the way his voice still lived inside my head, even when he wasn't around. And yet, even then, I wasn't broken. Just waiting. Waiting for a chance. Waiting for the door to open to something better. That chance came a few years later, when I got a scholarship, my ticket out. But before that moment, before the freedom, the flight, and everything that followed, there was still that house, that man, and the word that defined my childhood, burden. It was his favorite weapon. He didn't hit with fists every time. Sometimes he just used words sharp enough to leave invisible scars. And he wielded them well. Still, I think back now and realize that every insult, every humiliation, was laying the foundation for something stronger inside me. He was building me, without even knowing it. Each cruel sentence became a brick. Each night I spent crying became cement. He thought he was breaking me, but all along, he was constructing the very backbone that would one day hold up everything he lost. At 15, when he told me I'd never amount to anything, he had no idea what that sentence would build inside me. The year I turned 18, the air in our house felt different. He was angrier, heavier, almost like the walls were tired of holding his rage. The construction business was falling apart, debts, lawsuits, unfinished sites. And I was counting the days until graduation, praying for something, anything that could pull me out. That something came one afternoon when my teacher handed me a sealed envelope. The return address said International Scholars Program. My hands shook before I even opened it. Inside was a single line that changed everything. Congratulations, Alina. You've been awarded a full academic scholarship to study abroad. For a moment, I just stared at the words. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just breathed. Because for the first time, I could see the door that led out of that house. Out of his control, out of that word, burden. That night, I told my mom first. She hugged me like she was holding onto sunlight. Her eyes filled with tears, half joy, half fear. Then she whispered, "Your father should know." I dreaded that part. He was in his office, surrounded by half-empty bottles and unpaid bills. I stood in the doorway, the letter shaking in my hand. "Dad," I said quietly, "I got a scholarship to study abroad." He didn't even look up. "Scholarship?" he scoffed. "And who's paying for your flight? Your rent? Your food? You think the world is free?" I tried to speak, but he cut me off with that same smirk I'd seen 100 times. "You think you're smarter than me? You're not. You'll be back here in a month, begging for help." I remember walking out of that room with my fists clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. That was the night I stopped wishing he'd change. I realized the only thing I could change was myself. I had about $200 saved, small tutoring jobs, a few errands for neighbors. But that summer, I decided 200 wouldn't be enough. So I found work. By day, I waited tables at a small cafe near the market, 12-hour shifts, endless trays, fake smiles. By night, I cleaned offices downtown. I learned how to live on 3 hours of sleep and instant noodles. Some nights, I'd fall asleep standing, mop still in my hand. But every time I wanted to quit, I'd hear his voice in my head. "You'll never amount to anything." And I'd push harder. The cafe owner, a woman named Farah, used to watch me scrub tables long after closing. One night, she said, "You work like you're running from something." I smiled weakly. "I'm running towards something," I said. By the end of that summer, I had enough for a one-way ticket, a month of rent, and maybe 2 weeks of food if I stretched it. It wasn't much, but it was freedom. The night before I left, I packed everything I owned into one small suitcase, a few clothes, some books, and the scholarship letter I kept folded inside my journal. Mom came into my room while I was zipping the bag. She looked at me like she wanted to say 100 things but couldn't. Instead, she just said, "Don't let his voice follow you." I hugged her tight, feeling her tears soak into my shoulder. The next morning, the taxi arrived. Mom was ready, her scarf trembling in the breeze. My father didn't come. He said he was busy. Busy avoiding the goodbye he didn't deserve. At the airport, the air smelled of coffee and jet fuel, a strange mix of fear and promise. Mom held my face in her hands and whispered, "Call me when you land. And remember, you don't owe anyone anything." Her voice cracked on that last line. I nodded, even though my throat burned. When they called my boarding group, I turned one last time. She was standing there, small against the glass, waving through tears. There was no sign of him, just the empty space he left behind, like always. As I walked down the jet bridge, my heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The seats smelled like plastic and new beginnings. When the plane lifted off, the city lights below looked like scattered embers, the remnants of a fire I was finally leaving behind. I didn't know what waited on the other side of that flight. I didn't know how hard it would be, the loneliness, the hunger, the sleepless nights. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was never going back. I pressed my forehead against the window and whispered, "Goodbye." Not just to my country, but to the version of me that still begged for his approval. When the plane took off, I didn't just leave home. I left behind the need to be loved by someone who never knew how. And in that quiet moment above the clouds, for the first time in my life, I felt light. Because even though I had nothing, no money, no safety net, no idea what came next, I had something far more powerful. A promise to myself that I would never again let anyone make me feel like a burden. When I landed abroad, the first thing that hit me wasn't excitement. It was silence. No yelling, no slamming doors, no heavy footsteps. Just the low hum of airport announcements in a language I barely understood. For a moment I stood there, small suitcase in hand, backpack on my shoulders, and realized I was completely alone. And for the first time, that felt like freedom. The first few months were brutal. My scholarship covered tuition, but not living expenses. Rent, food, transport, those were on me. And let me tell you, being poor in a foreign country doesn't feel romantic like in the movies. It feels like being invisible. I rented a single room in an old apartment shared with 3 other students. The walls were thin, the heater barely worked, and the sound of rain against the cracked window became my lullaby. There were nights when the hunger kept me awake, when I'd drink water just to trick my stomach into feeling full. I learned how to stretch a bag of rice for 2 weeks. I learned which grocery stores gave discounts after closing time. And I learned to pretend I wasn't starving when my classmates invited me out and I had to say no again. But every morning, I woke up with the same thought. I'm not going back. Between lectures, I'd spend hours in the university library. It was warm there, warmer than my room, and no one asked questions. I'd sit in a corner with my old laptop, scrolling through free online tutorials, teaching myself how to code. HTML, CSS, JavaScript, Python. The languages of logic and structure. So different from the chaos I'd grown up in. Coding became my escape, my form of control. Because unlike people, code made sense. It did what you told it to, no yelling, no punishment, no unpredictable moods. At first, I failed. Constantly. Lines of code wouldn't work, errors popped up everywhere. And I'd stay up until sunrise trying to fix them. But failure didn't scare me anymore. I'd been failing someone's expectations my entire life. This time, the failure was mine. And that made it okay. I started taking small freelance jobs online. Simple things, fixing broken websites, writing scripts, creating landing pages. $5 here, $10 there. It wasn't much, but every payment felt like a small rebellion, proof that I could survive without him. There was one project I'll never forget. A client in Canada wanted a basic blog site built in 2 days. I worked through the night, eyes burning, hands stiff from the cold. When I finally delivered it, he sent me a message. "You're talented. You should charge more." It was the first time anyone had said something like that to me. It felt unreal. From there, I kept going. Job after job. Line after line of code. Every project added another drop of confidence into a bucket that had once been empty. And slowly, that bucket started to fill. One night during exam season, I was sitting in the library, surrounded by half-empty coffee cups and open tabs on my laptop. I noticed students struggling to keep track of deadlines and assignments. Sticky notes everywhere, reminders scribbled on notebooks. That's when an idea sparked. What if I built something to help us stay organized? I thought. Nothing big, just a simple productivity app for students like me. A place to list tasks, set reminders, and track progress. It was small, manageable, something I could actually finish. For 2 months, I built that app piece by piece. In between classes and freelance work. I didn't have fancy tools or mentors. Just YouTube tutorials, Reddit forums, and stubbornness. When I finally launched it, I posted about it in a few student Facebook groups. The response was slow at first, a few downloads, a couple of kind comments. But then something unexpected happened. A TikTok influencer, a college student with millions of followers, mentioned it in a short clip. She said, "I've been using this new student planner app, and it's literally saving my semester." That was it. 15 seconds of video changed everything. By the next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Downloads poured in. Emails from students, bloggers, even small tech reviewers started flooding my inbox. The app wasn't perfect. It was simple, even clunky at times. But people loved that it felt real, built by someone who understood them. Within 2 months, it hit 100,000 downloads. Then a small startup reached out. They wanted to buy it. At first, I thought it was a scam. Why would anyone pay real money for something I built in the library between ramen dinners? But after a few calls and signed papers, the deal went through. They wired $60,000 to my account. When I saw the balance, I froze. My hands started shaking, not from greed, but disbelief. Because for the first time in my life, I felt free. Free from the fear of not having enough. Free from the voice that said I couldn't survive without him. Free from the years of being told I was worthless. I sat there, staring at the numbers on the screen, and I thought of that 15-year-old girl, the one who sat on the floor of her room, vowing she'd never need her father again. She had done it. She had saved herself. That 60,000 wasn't just money. It was proof. Proof that pain could become power. That the things meant to break you could be rebuilt into something beautiful. I didn't go out to celebrate. Instead, I walked to a small hill near campus, the one that overlooked the city lights. I sat there for hours, just breathing. The wind was cold, the air sharp. But inside I felt warm, like something heavy had finally been lifted from my chest. The next day, I opened a new document on my laptop. I typed a single line at the top. What if this is only the beginning? Because deep down, I knew it was. That little app had opened a door, and I was ready to walk through it, step by step. Into a life I was building with my own 2 hands. I started learning about business, marketing, startups. Every night, I'd study case studies and user experience design. While my classmates partied, I built prototypes. While others slept, I dreamed awake in code. And for the first time, I wasn't running away from something. I was running towards something. A version of me who wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't just surviving now. I was growing, changing, becoming. And I had no idea that this transformation, this quiet success, would soon bring me face to face with a man who once called me a burden. But that comes later. For now, I can still see that screen. $60,000 staring back at me, hands trembling over the keyboard, not because I was rich, but because, for the first time, I was free. After that first breakthrough, the $60,000, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just relief. It was realization. I had finally proven to myself that I could build something from nothing. But the thing about finally tasting freedom? It makes you hungry for more. I didn't want to stop at one app or one lucky break. I wanted to build something that lasted. Something that couldn't be taken away. So I went back to work, harder than ever. Days blurred into nights, nights into early mornings. I'd wake up to the hum of my laptop and the blue light painting my walls. Every sound of a notification was electricity, a reminder that I was moving forward. I used part of the money to buy a better laptop, a second monitor, and an ergonomic chair. Simple things, but for me they were symbols, proof that I was no longer surviving on scraps. I was building. That's when I started connecting with other developers online. Forums, chat groups, late-night code reviews, the kind of digital friendships built on shared struggle and ambition. That's how I met Leo and Ria, two brilliant coders from different countries, both with stories that mirrored my own. We talked every day, trading code snippets, ideas, and dreams about one day creating something bigger. One night, during a call that lasted until dawn, Leo said, "What if we built something together? Something that actually helps small businesses work smarter?" That question became the spark. Within weeks, the three of us registered a tiny startup. We called it Nexify Systems, a name that meant nothing to anyone else. But to us, it meant next chance, next life, next freedom. At first, we worked out of our bedrooms. 3 screens, 3 time zones, and a shared Google Drive folder that held our entire future. The mission was simple. Build software that could automate client management for small businesses. Invoices, reminders, appointments, all the boring admin stuff that drains owners' time. We wanted to give people back their hours, because we knew what it felt like to have none. The first version of Nexify was rough. It crashed constantly. The interface looked like a puzzle that didn't quite fit. But we kept going. Every day we'd test, debug, redesign, test again. There were nights when my hands ached from typing, and my eyes burned from staring at code that refused to work. But failure wasn't frightening anymore. It was familiar. It was fuel. We launched the beta version 6 months later. At first, only a handful of businesses signed up. A bakery in Canada, a dental clinic in Singapore, a gym in the UK. But they loved it. They gave feedback, requested new features, and told other owners. Word started to spread. Within a year, we had clients in 15 countries. Small businesses were saving time, cutting costs, and actually thanking us. Every thank you email felt like a tiny miracle. Then came our first big investor, a quiet man from Dubai who'd seen one of our case studies online. He offered funding in exchange for a small stake. We didn't even celebrate, we just got back to work. Because for the first time, the dream wasn't just about survival. It was about creation. The next year was chaos, beautiful, exhausting chaos. We hired a small team, 3 developers, 2 designers, and 1 marketer who believed in our vision. We rented a co-working space, our first office. It wasn't fancy. Just white walls, buzzing lights, and a coffee machine that never worked properly. But it was ours. We'd stay there until 3 a.m., eating instant noodles, scribbling on whiteboards, and arguing about color schemes and user flows like our lives depended on it. And in a way they did. There were setbacks too. A server crash wiped out weeks of data. An investor backed out at the last minute. Once, a bug caused a client's invoices to duplicate 100 times. And I stayed up 40 hours straight fixing it, shaking from caffeine and panic. But we made it through. Every failure made us sharper. Every crisis made us tougher. We didn't break. We adapted. And slowly, Nexify Systems started making real money. By our second year, we were pulling in 6 figures annually. Businesses were renewing contracts without hesitation. And then came the call that changed everything. A mid-sized tech company wanted to acquire us. At first, I thought it was too soon. But after weeks of negotiation, legal paperwork, and sleepless nights, we agreed on a deal that would secure our futures. When the deal closed, I got my share of the payout. $1.3 million. I remember that night vividly. The apartment was dark, quiet, just me, my laptop, and the city lights bleeding through the blinds. I opened my banking app and stared at the number. 1.3 million. For a long moment, I didn't move. It didn't feel real. Because the last time I had stared at a number like that, it was negative. My father's debts. Our house hanging by a thread. Our family surviving on fumes. And now here I was, 24 years old. A girl who once scrubbed office floors and skipped meals. Sitting in her apartment as a self-made millionaire. I wanted to call my mom. I wanted to tell her that everything she'd suffered hadn't been in vain. That her quiet endurance had given birth to this victory. But I couldn't bring myself to pick up the phone. Not yet. Not until I knew what I was feeling. Because the truth was, the money wasn't what made me emotional. It was the silence. The absence of his voice in my head. For once, I didn't hear him saying, "You'll never make it." I didn't feel that old heaviness. There was just peace. And the soft hum of a world I had built on my own terms. I poured myself a glass of water, not champagne, and raised it to the air. To freedom, I whispered. To the little girl who refused to give up. I sat there for hours, the glow of the laptop screen lighting my face, thinking about how far I'd come. From the small, scared girl who couldn't afford a meal, to the woman who owned her own time, her own company, her own future. That night, I felt like the story had finally come full circle. Like maybe this was the ending. The happy one. But life has a way of testing your peace. Just when you think the past is behind you, it finds a way to knock on your door again. And sometimes it doesn't knock, it texts. That night, as I stared at my laptop, my phone buzzed on the table beside me. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Alina, it's your father. Call me. It's urgent." The message came at midnight. "Alina, it's your father. Call me. It's urgent." 8 years. 8 years of silence. And that's how he reached out. No apology. No warmth. Just urgency. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen, the glow of my phone reflecting in my glass of water. My chest tightened, not from love, but from the sudden flood of old memories. The weight of every insult, every moment he made me feel like nothing. I almost turned off my phone. Almost. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. So I called. The voice that answered wasn't the one I remembered. It was thinner, weaker, stripped of the authority that used to fill every room. "Alina," he said, and for the first time, there was uncertainty in his tone. "Yes," I replied. Silence. Then a breath. "I need your help." He didn't even pretend to care how I was doing. He went straight to business. His construction company had gone under. Bad investments, failed contracts, and the kind of debts you don't just walk away from. He owed people, not banks, not friends, people you don't want to owe money to. They were threatening him, threatening the house, threatening Mom. He said the words fast, desperate, like a man drowning and reaching for the nearest hand. And then he said it. The sentence that flipped a switch inside me. "You're my daughter. You owe me this much." Owe him? The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. The man who once said I was a burden, now expected me to carry him. But I didn't laugh. I didn't even breathe. I just listened. And in that silence, something cold and clear began forming in my mind. When he finished, I said softly, "I'll think about it." Then I hung up. For 2 days, I couldn't focus. Every email, every meeting blurred in my mind. I thought about Mom, her quiet eyes, her trembling hands every time he raised his voice. I thought about how she used to whisper, "Stay quiet, Beta. Don't make it worse." And now she was still with him, still in that house, still under the shadow of his ruin. On the 3rd day, my phone rang again. It was Mom, and the moment I heard her voice, my resolve cracked. She was crying. "Alina, please. They're saying they'll take the house. Your father, he's not well. Please help." That did it. I couldn't bear the thought of her losing everything because of him. I told her gently, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of it." But in my heart I knew, this time, I wasn't just saving them. I was ending the story on my terms. That night, I sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop and started drafting legal documents. Transfer agreements, ownership deeds, power of attorney forms. All clean. All airtight. When I was done, I called him again. "Dad," I said, "I'll pay off everything. The debts, the loans, all of it." He exhaled loudly, almost a sob. "Thank you, Beta. I knew you wouldn't forget your family." I let him finish, then added, "But there's one condition." "What condition?" he asked, cautious now. "I'll need you to sign over your company and all assets, the house, the land, the vehicles, into my name. Temporarily, of course. It'll make handling the payments and legal processes easier. I'll transfer everything back once it's settled." He paused. For a moment, I thought he'd question me. But desperation makes people blind. He sighed. "If that's what it takes, fine. Just fix this mess." The next morning, I flew home. The air felt heavy the moment I landed, the smell of dust, diesel, and memories. When I walked into that old house, it was like stepping into a museum of pain. The same chipped paint, the same dull furniture, the same silence. Mom hugged me like she hadn't breathed in years. She smelled like cardamom and tears. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. I held her tightly. Then I saw him. My father, the man who once towered over me, looked small. His hair grey, his face lined, his eyes bloodshot. The weight of years had crushed him more than any debt ever could. He didn't meet my gaze at first. He just muttered, "So, you're here to fix it?" I nodded. "Let's get the paperwork done." We sat across from each other at the dining table. The same table where he once told me I'd never be anything. Now it was covered in contracts, pens, and documents with my name printed in bold. He didn't read a word. He just signed, page after page. I watched his hand tremble as he wrote his signature, the mark of a man giving away everything he'd once used to control others. When it was done, I looked up and said quietly, "I'll handle the rest." Over the next week, I wired the money. Every cent. I cleared his debts. I called his creditors, negotiated settlements, moved funds through legitimate channels. One by one, the threats disappeared. The house was safe. The business was debt-free. He was free. And I owned everything. When the final confirmation email arrived, I forwarded it to him. Subject line, "All clear." I hit send. Then I waited. It took less than an hour. He stormed into the living room, red-faced, shaking with anger. "What have you done?" he shouted. I stayed calm. "What do you mean?" "You tricked me," he roared. "You made me sign everything over. This is my company, my house. How dare you?" I looked him straight in the eye. I said quietly. "It was your company. It was your house. Now it's mine." His face went pale. He took a step back, breathing hard, searching for words that could cut me down again. But this time, they wouldn't come. I stood up, slowly, deliberately. "You once told me I'd never amount to anything," I said, my voice steady. "Now I own everything you lost." He froze. The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time in my life, he looked small, not because of age or defeat, but because the illusion of his power was gone. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just stared at me, as if seeing me for the first time. And in that moment, I didn't feel triumph. I felt something colder. Justice. I didn't kick him or Mom out. I told them they could stay, rent-free. I wasn't here for revenge that destroyed. I was here for revenge that ended the cycle. Over the next few days, I handled the rest, renamed the company, updated the ownership records, restructured the business. Within a week, the empire that once belonged to him now had my signature on every corner of it. Mom tried to thank me, but I could see the conflict in her eyes, relief and guilt, tangled together. Dad didn't speak to me. Not a word. He'd sit in the garden, staring at the ground, the sound of birds filling the silence where his voice used to be. Sometimes, I'd catch him glancing at me from the porch. Not with hatred, not with pride, just confusion, as if he was still trying to understand how the burden had become the backbone. And one evening, as the sun dipped behind the old mango tree, he finally broke the silence. "I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "You're not a burden. You're the only reason we're still here." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was the apology I'd wanted my whole life, but it arrived too late, wrapped in regret. I nodded slowly. "I know," I said. Then I walked away. After the signatures dried and the money left my account, the world didn't explode. There was no thunderclap of victory, no cinematic soundtrack swelling behind me. Just silence. The kind of silence that settles after a war, heavy, still, uncertain. The papers were done. The debts were gone. And I had become the legal owner of everything my father once built. The business, the land, the house I grew up in, all of it. But instead of triumph, what I felt was strange. It wasn't joy. It wasn't guilt. It was something in between, like standing in the ruins of a battlefield, knowing you've won, but realizing you're surrounded by ghosts. I told my parents they could stay in the house, rent-free. I didn't want them on the street. I didn't want revenge that destroyed. I wanted peace that lasted. Mom tried to protest. "You've already done too much," she said, her eyes wet with both pride and shame. But I stopped her. "This isn't charity," I said softly. "It's home, and you belong here." She hugged me tight, tighter than she ever had before. And in that hug, I felt something loosen inside me. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe fatigue. Maybe both. My father, on the other hand, didn't say much at all. He'd pass me in the hallway and nod, sometimes mumble a thanks, but mostly, he was quiet. Too quiet. This was the same man whose voice used to shake the walls, who'd command everyone's attention, whose anger filled every corner of our house. And now he moved like a shadow, silent, subdued, unsure. At first, I thought the quiet was relief, that maybe he'd finally accepted what had happened. But then I realized it wasn't peace. It was shame. He couldn't look at me without seeing everything he'd said, everything he'd done. And I couldn't look at him without remembering every wound he'd left behind. We existed like two ghosts haunting the same house, bound by blood, but separated by years of hurt. Mom became the bridge between us. She'd bring tea to both rooms, talk to him, talk to me, try to stitch something invisible together. I could tell she was lighter, freer. Her laughter started returning, soft at first, then real. It was the sound of someone who no longer had to live in fear. Sometimes, I'd catch her humming while cooking, her face peaceful in a way I'd never seen before. And every time I saw that, I knew it was worth it. Every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every scar, worth it. But my father, he faded. He spent long hours sitting in the garden, staring at nothing. The man who once barked orders now barely spoke above a whisper. He'd pick at the grass, sip his tea, and lose himself in the hum of crickets. One evening, I came home from work and found him sitting there again, same spot, same silence. The sun was setting behind him, washing his gray hair in gold. He looked smaller somehow, weaker, almost fragile. I sat down beside him without saying anything. For a while, we just listened to the sounds of the neighborhood. Children playing, dogs barking, life going on. It was strange being there with him after everything. Like sitting next to the ghost of a man who had once terrified you. Finally, he spoke. "You really did it," he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement, flat, honest. "I did," I said. He nodded slowly, still staring at the horizon. Then he sighed, long, tired, heavy. "I spent my whole life building things," he said. "And somehow I destroyed everything I touched." I didn't answer. There was nothing to say that wouldn't reopen old wounds. "I used to think control made me strong," he continued. "That shouting made people listen. But it just made everyone afraid." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. I was wrong, Alina. Hearing my name from his lips felt strange, like a word that had been foreign for too long. He turned his head and finally met my eyes. For the first time, I saw tears. Not angry tears. Not manipulative tears. Just regret. I'm sorry, he said, barely above a whisper. I should have protected you, not broken you. I didn't know how to respond. My throat tightened. For years, I'd imagined this moment, the apology, the reckoning. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing in the ashes of something that could never be rebuilt. I looked at him for a long moment and said, I know. Then I stood up and walked back inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying his words over and over. I'm sorry. 2 words that should have come years ago. Words that might have changed everything if they'd been spoken sooner. But life doesn't give you rewinds. Only consequences. In the weeks that followed, things began to settle into a rhythm. Mom and I grew closer. We started cooking together, watching old movies, laughing about little things. She'd tell me stories from when I was a child, moments I'd forgotten, or maybe just blocked out. And slowly, she began to heal too. There was color in her cheeks again, warmth in her eyes. She'd go out with friends, visit relatives, live. As for my father, he remained quiet. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me as I left for work. His face unreadable. Maybe pride, maybe sorrow, maybe both. But he never raised his voice again. Not once. And in that silence, I found something I'd been chasing my whole life, closure. Not the explosive, movie kind, but the quiet kind that comes when you finally realize the monster in your story isn't a monster anymore. Just a man. Broken, small, human. He'd lost everything, power, control, pride. But in losing it, he'd finally seen me. The night I left for the airport years ago, he didn't show up. The night I came home and saved everything, he didn't thank me. But that evening in the garden, when he said nothing, when he couldn't look at me, that was the moment I knew. For the first time in my life, he didn't have anything to say. It started quietly. At first, it was just little things. The way Dad walked slower, how his hands trembled when he lifted his cup, how Mom's voice carried more worry than usual when she spoke about him. I brushed it off at first. He was getting older. Life had taken its toll. But then one afternoon, my phone rang while I was in a meeting. It was Mom. Her voice was trembling. Alina, she whispered, your father's in the hospital. For a moment, the world stopped moving. I couldn't speak, couldn't think. All the air seemed to leave the room. I left immediately, didn't even grab my coat. The drive to the hospital felt endless. Every red light burned into my nerves. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so hard they ached. When I finally walked into the ward, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked small. Not just older, smaller, like the years had folded him inward. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken. The tubes and monitors around him beeped steadily, indifferent to the weight of the moment. Mom sat beside him, holding his hand, whispering something I couldn't hear. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears, a mixture of relief and sorrow. I stepped closer, slowly. Dad turned his head. His eyes found mine, weak, watery, but still familiar. Alina, he murmured, his voice barely audible. I hadn't heard my name sound like that before, not filled with authority, but with something softer. Fragile. How are you feeling? I asked quietly. He smiled faintly, as if amused by the question. Old, he said. Tired. I wanted to say something back, but the words wouldn't come. Years of anger, pain, and resentment crowded my throat. Mom stood up gently. I'll go get some tea, she said, leaving us alone. The silence that followed was heavy. Just the beeping of the monitor, the hum of machines, and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Then he spoke again. I've been thinking, he said slowly, his voice cracking. About everything. About you. I stayed still, afraid that if I moved, the moment would break. He swallowed hard. I was so wrong, he said. About you. About everything. I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear it, every word. I thought being a father meant control, he continued. I thought fear would make you strong, but all I did was make you feel small. His eyes shimmered with tears. You were never a burden, Alina. You were the only good thing I ever did right, and I was too blind to see it. My chest tightened. For years, I had imagined hearing those words, but I never imagined how they'd sound coming from a frail man lying in a hospital bed. I saw what you built, he whispered. Your company. Your success. Everyone talks about it. You proved me wrong in every way possible. A weak smile tugged at his lips. I'm proud of you, Beta. Truly proud. For a second, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was grief. Grief for all the years that could have been different, for the love that could have existed if only he'd known how to give it. Tears welled in my eyes, and I tried to blink them away. He reached out, his trembling hand searching for mine. I hesitated, then placed my hand in his. His skin was cold, thin, but his grip was firm. Desperate. Do you hate me? He asked softly. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something I never expected. I didn't. Once, I thought revenge would heal me, that owning everything he'd lost would erase the pain. But standing there, holding his hand, I understood the truth. Revenge gives power, not peace. I squeezed his hand gently. No, I said. I don't hate you. He nodded, tears rolling down his cheeks. I wish I'd been better, he whispered. I wish I'd known how. I smiled faintly. You did the best you could with what you had. It wasn't absolution, not really, but it was release. The nurse came in briefly to check his vitals. Mom returned with tea, quietly sitting on the other side. For the first time in decades, the three of us shared a space without tension. Just quiet. Just breath. He drifted in and out of sleep as the evening wore on. Before leaving, I leaned close and whispered, Rest, Dad. You don't have to carry it anymore. He nodded weakly, a faint smile on his lips. Thank you, Beta. As I walked out of that hospital room, the cold night air hit my face, and I finally understood what forgiveness really meant. Forgiveness isn't saying what you did was okay. It's saying it no longer controls me. And in that moment, the weight I'd carried my whole life, the anger, the hurt, the endless need to prove myself, finally began to lift. It happened quietly, almost too quietly for something that had once defined so much of my life. A few weeks after that hospital visit, I got another call. It was early morning. The sky outside was pale, the kind of gray that feels like the world hasn't fully woken up yet. When I saw Mom's name on the screen, my heart already knew. Her voice was soft, trembling. He's gone, Alina. I didn't cry. Not immediately. I just sat there, staring out the window, watching the city slowly come to life. Cars moved. Birds sang. The world didn't stop, even though mine had just shifted again. When I reached the hospital, the room was still. He looked peaceful, like the years of anger and regret had finally left his body. His chest no longer fought for breath. His hands, once trembling, rested calmly on the blanket. Mom was sitting beside him, her fingers intertwined with his. Her eyes were red, but her expression was calm, the calm that comes from acceptance, not shock. "I was here," she said softly. "He went in his sleep." I nodded, unable to find words. For so many years, I had imagined how this day would feel. Would I feel satisfaction? Relief? But instead I felt gratitude. Not for what he had done, but for the fact that before he left, he tried to make things right. After the funeral arrangements were made, I found myself in his study, the same room that had once terrified me as a child. The smell of old paper and aftershave still lingered. His desk was neat, unusually so, with everything stacked in quiet order. I don't know what I was looking for, maybe closure, maybe proof that our last conversation had meant something to him. And then I saw it. A folded envelope, tucked beneath a small wooden box. My name written across it in his shaky handwriting, Alina. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was a short letter, just a few lines, but they said everything he never could in words. To my daughter, you were never the burden I said you were. You carried what I couldn't. You built what I destroyed. You'll build something greater than I ever could, because you learned strength not from comfort, but from pain. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. Dad. By the time I reached the end, the words blurred through my tears. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. It was the first time he had ever written the word sorry. I folded the letter carefully and held it to my chest. For years, I'd built walls around my heart, walls of ambition, success, and strength, to protect the little girl who had once been told she wasn't enough. And now, for the first time, I let those walls fall. The funeral was simple. No grand speeches, no crowd, just close family and a quiet grave beneath a tall neem tree. The wind was soft that day. The sunlight filtered through the leaves like it was trying to comfort us. As the priest finished his prayer, I stepped forward. I placed the letter, the one he'd written to me, on the coffin before they lowered it. "I forgive you," I whispered, not because he asked for it, but because I needed to, because holding on to pain had kept me tied to him far longer than love ever had. As the earth covered the casket, I felt something inside me shift. Like a deep breath I'd been holding for years finally exhaled. After everyone left, I stayed. I sat beside the fresh grave, tracing his name on the stone with my fingertips. The air was quiet, warm. A few birds perched on the branches above. I thought about everything, the pain, the anger, the years I spent proving him wrong. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fight anymore. I didn't feel like the wounded girl or the victorious woman. I just felt human. Looking at his name, I whispered softly. He was wrong. I wasn't a burden. I smiled through my tears. I was his blessing. He just never saw it. The breeze picked up then, soft but steady, brushing past my face like a touch. And in that moment, I chose to believe it was him, finally at peace, finally proud, finally free. I stood up, dusted my hands, and turned toward the light. The past no longer pulled me back. It simply walked beside me, quieter now, softer. I left the graveyard with a calm heart, knowing that the story had ended the only way it could. Not with vengeance, but with forgiveness. Not with power, but with peace. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Not even to him. A year later, I was invited to speak at a women's leadership conference. It was held in a glass-walled auditorium overlooking the city, the kind of view that makes you believe anything is possible. As I stood on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, I felt that familiar flutter in my chest, not fear but memory. Because once, I couldn't even speak in my own house without being told to stay quiet. Now, I was standing in front of strangers who came to hear me. I began with a question. How many of you have ever been told you weren't enough? Almost every hand went up. A quiet murmur swept through the room, the kind that says we've all been there. I smiled softly. Me too. Then I told them my story, not as a tale of revenge, but as a reminder that sometimes the people who break you the deepest are the ones who hand you the tools to rebuild yourself stronger. That pain, as unbearable as it feels, is often just potential that hasn't yet found its purpose. I spoke about the girl who was once afraid to dream. The girl who thought love had to be earned through perfection. The girl who turned her hurt into fuel, her silence into success. And I told them this. You don't have to prove your worth to those who can't see it. You just have to become it. Because when you stop chasing validation and start creating value, the world changes around you. For a moment, the room was completely still. Then came the applause, not the loud roaring kind, but the heartfelt kind. The kind that feels like healing. As I stepped off the stage, a young woman stopped me. She said, I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I know I'm going to start. And that was everything. Because my story was never just about revenge. It was about redemption. About breaking a cycle that had passed through generations. It was about proving to myself most of all that survival isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. When the lights dimmed and I walked out into the cool evening air, I looked up at the city skyline, bright, alive, endless. For the first time, I didn't see struggle. I saw possibility. And I whispered to myself, I was once called a burden, but I built a life so strong, even my scars stand tall. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button. Share it with someone who needs hope tonight, and tell me in the comments,